January 30th, 1945, 7:45 p.m. Cabanatuan Camp, Luzon, Philippines. The dirt beneath Captain Robert Prince's belly was still warm from the day's heat, but his hands were ice. For 3 hours, he had lain motionless in the tall grass 800 yards from the prison camp's perimeter, watching the guards change shifts through field glasses while mosquitoes fed on his neck. Behind him, 90 Rangers from C Company lay equally still, their bodies pressed into the earth like men already dead. The only sound was breathing, shallow, controlled, military breathing that could pass for wind through the cogon grass. Through the binoculars, Prince could see them. The prisoners? What remained of them? Skeletal figures moved behind the wire in a shambling gait that barely qualified as walking. Some supported each other. Others sat motionless against barracks walls, conserving the calories required to stand. Prince had been briefed on their condition, survivors of the Bataan Death March, imprisoned for nearly 3 years, weighing 70 or 80 pounds if they were lucky. The intelligence estimate said there were roughly 500 left. Once this camp had held over 8,000. At 7:40 p.m., Lieutenant William Nellist of the Alamo Scouts, positioned to Prince's left, hand-signaled the final confirmation. Guards counted, positions marked, telephone lines to Cabanatuan City cut. 5 miles away, Captain Juan Pajota's 200 Filipino guerrillas waited at the Cabu River bridge, ready to hold off the 1,000 Japanese troops stationed across the water. Everything beyond this field was enemy territory. Everything behind them, 30 miles of jungle and Japanese patrols, was the gauntlet they'd have to run again, this time carrying human beings who could barely lift their own heads. Prince checked his watch. 15 minutes. Above, right on schedule, he heard it, the distinctive twin-engine rumble of a P-61 Black Widow night fighter. The plane dropped low over the camp, its Pratt & Whitney engines backfiring deliberately, spectacularly. Prince watched through the glasses as every Japanese guard turned their faces skyward, transfixed by the massive black aircraft performing barrel rolls and steep climbs against the darkening sky. At precisely 7:45 p.m., Prince gave the signal. What happened next would take exactly 30 minutes. 4 days earlier, January 26, 1945, 6th Army Headquarters, Calasiao, Luzon. Major Robert Lapham arrived on horseback, his uniform stained with 4 days of jungle travel, his mount exhausted. He had ridden 30 miles through Japanese-held territory with information that could not wait for radio transmission, could not be entrusted to anyone else. Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's intelligence chief, Colonel Horton White, met him in the command tent. Lapham didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Cabanatuan," he said. "We're running out of time." Lapham commanded Filipino guerrilla forces operating behind Japanese lines. His scouts had been monitoring the prison camp for months, watching the Japanese consolidate their forces, watching the prisoner population dwindle as men died from disease and malnutrition, or were shipped north to slave labor sites in Formosa and Manchuria. But something had changed in the past 3 weeks, something that made Lapham ride through enemy territory instead of sleeping. "We intercepted radio traffic," Lapham continued, spreading reconnaissance photographs across White's desk. "Orders from 4th Army Headquarters. Kill orders." The photographs, taken by reconnaissance aircraft on January 19th, showed the camp layout in stark detail. The barbed wire perimeter, the guard towers, the skeletal barracks, the 500 men inside who had no idea that their captors had received instructions to execute them before American forces arrived. White studied the photos in silence. Everyone in the tent knew about Palawan. Just 6 weeks earlier, on December 14th, the Japanese had herded 150 American POWs into air raid shelters on Palawan Island, locked them inside, poured gasoline over the structures, and burned them alive. Those who tried to escape were shot or bayoneted. Only 11 men survived by hiding under a cliff until nightfall, then swimming 9 miles to a Filipino guerrilla camp. "I estimate we have 500 men in the camp," Lapham said. "Maybe 100 to 300 Japanese guards inside, another 1,000 across the Cabu River, 5,000 in Cabanatuan City, 3 miles south." "And you want to do what exactly?" White asked, though he already knew the answer. "Rescue them, all of them, before the kill order gets executed." White looked at the map, calculating distances, odds, impossibilities. "I Corps wouldn't reach Cabanatuan until January 31st at the earliest, 6 days away. If any rescue were to happen, it would have to be now." It would have to be a small force moving fast and light deep behind enemy lines against overwhelming numbers. It would have to be the kind of operation that military academies would later classify as either genius or insanity, depending entirely on whether it succeeded. "I'll take it to Kruger," White said. "But you need to understand something, Major. If we do this, those boys are betting their lives that we can get there and get out before 5,000 Japanese soldiers realize what's happening. And if something goes wrong, if we're compromised, if the intelligence is bad, if we're late by even an hour, those prisoners will die screaming while we listen on the radio." Lapham met his eyes. "They're dying now, just more slowly." That afternoon, Lieutenant General Walter Kruger approved the mission 3 years earlier, April 9, 1942. Bataan Peninsula, Philippines. When Major General Edward King surrendered the American and Filipino forces on Bataan against General Douglas MacArthur's orders, but facing the reality that his men were starving and out of ammunition, he condemned 76,000 men to captivity. The Japanese had prepared camps for 10,000 to 25,000 prisoners. They got 76,000. What followed became known as the Bataan Death March, though that name, sanitized by distance and time, fails to capture what actually happened on that 60-mile forced march from Mariveles to Camp O'Donnell in the brutal heat of April. Private First Class Richard Beck, 192nd Tank Battalion, made the march. He was 22 years old from Wisconsin and had been in the Philippines for 4 months when the surrender came. In the years that followed, he would rarely speak about those 6 days in April, except in the most clinical terms, as if reducing the experience to facts could drain it of its power to return in dreams. The facts: 76,000 men began the march. An estimated 20,000 died along the way. They walked in columns of 4 under a sun that turned the national highway into a furnace. No food. Minimal water, and what water existed came from roadside ditches, contaminated with the bodies of men who had collapsed there hours earlier. Men with dysentery soiled themselves as they walked, unable to stop, unable to clean themselves. Men with malaria shook with fever, supported by friends whose own legs trembled with exhaustion. The rules were simple: keep walking or die. Men who fell were beaten. If they couldn't get up, they were bayoneted. Some were beheaded as examples. Some were buried alive. At one point, Japanese guards locked 115 men inside a metal warehouse in a 110-degree heat. 50 died of suffocation. The guards made sport of it. They forced prisoners to kneel in the direct sun for hours. They withheld water, then made men beg for it. They struck prisoners with rifle butts for entertainment, betting on which blows would drop a man fastest. Medic John Richardson, also of the 192nd Tank Battalion, tried to help men along the route. He watched Japanese guards beat men to death with shovels. He watched them select prisoners at random and decapitate them by the roadside while the columns kept walking. He learned to avert his eyes, to keep moving, to become invisible through sheer force of will. "You stopped being human," he said years later in a rare interview. "You became something else, something that just put one foot in front of the other, because that's what the thing that used to be, you knew how to do." Of the 76,000 men who started the march, only 54,000 reached Camp O'Donnell. Most of the survivors were eventually transferred to Cabanatuan, a former Philippine Army training camp. They thought perhaps that the worst was over. They were wrong. December 1942, December 1944, Cabanatuan Camp. At its peak, Cabanatuan held 8,000 American and Filipino prisoners. The camp sprawled across a cleared area northeast of Cabanatuan City, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. The barracks were bamboo and thatch, designed for tropical ventilation but offering no protection from mosquitoes or the elements. Men slept on bamboo slats with no mattresses, sometimes sharing the space with rats the size of small cats. The Japanese provided 550 grams of rice per day per prisoner, about 18 ounces, enough to keep a man barely alive if supplemented with other food. But there was no other food, or very little. Sometimes there were vegetables. Sometimes there were worms in the rice. The men ate the worms. Protein was protein. Within 6 months, beriberi had become epidemic. The thiamine deficiency caused by the rice-only diet led to nerve damage, muscle wasting, and heart failure. Men's legs swelled with edema until the skin split. They went blind. They lost the ability to walk. Dysentery, malaria, dengue fever, and diphtheria swept through the barracks in waves. The hospital, such as it was, had no medicine. American and Filipino doctors tried to treat infections with maggot therapy, placing fly larvae in wounds to eat dead tissue because they had no antibiotics. Sometimes it worked. Usually it didn't. Men died at a rate of 30 to 50 per day in the camp's first year. The burial details couldn't keep up. Bodies waited in the sun for hours, sometimes days. But here is what breaks the heart 3 generations later, what makes this story nearly unbearable to contemplate. The men organized themselves. They created an internal governance structure with rules and responsibilities. They held church services. They taught classes to each other, engineering, languages, history, anything to keep their minds from succumbing to the same decay attacking their bodies. They formed orchestras with instruments made from scavenged materials. They put on plays. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Mack, the senior American officer in the camp, established a system of justice to prevent the camp from descending into chaos. Men were court-martialed for theft from other prisoners, the worst crime imaginable in a place where an extra spoonful of rice meant the difference between surviving another day and not. The sentences were harsh because survival required order. Alfred Jolly, a private from Tennessee, described the mental game everyone played. You made yourself believe you'd go home. You pictured your mother's face. You pictured your hometown. You made it real in your mind, real enough to believe, because if you stopped believing, you'd just lay down and die. And that's what most of the men did. They just stopped. By December 1944, most of the able-bodied prisoners had been shipped north to labor camps in Japan, Formosa, and Manchuria. Many went to their deaths on hell ships, unmarked transport vessels that were bombed by Allied aircraft, who had no way of knowing they carried American prisoners. The camp population dwindled to around 500 men, the sick, the injured, the too weak to work. These were the men the Rangers were coming to save. The ones who had survived everything, the Death March, 3 years of starvation, disease, and arbitrary brutality, only to face execution orders from an empire losing its war. January 27-29, 1945, the approach march. At 5 p.m. on January 27th, 14 Alamo Scouts departed from Gimba, the last village under American control. These were the elite reconnaissance troops of 6th Army, men selected for their ability to operate independently behind enemy lines. Their mission: scout the route to Cabanatuan, establish surveillance on the prison camp, confirm enemy positions, and wait. Lieutenant William Nellist led one team. Lieutenant Thomas Rounceville led the other. They moved at night, guided by Filipino guerrillas who knew every trail, every village, every place where Japanese patrols might be encountered. The guerrillas led them on routes that avoided roads, kept to jungle and rice paddies, passed through villages where the residents hid them in barns and fed them. The Filipino resistance had been waiting 3 years for this moment. The next day, at 2 p.m. on January 28th, the main force departed. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci commanded the 6th Ranger Battalion. He brought 121 men, 90 from C Company and 31 from F Company. They drove in trucks as far as Balangkaran, then dismounted and slipped into enemy territory on foot. What follows is a paradox of military operations. 121 men moving through hostile territory should have been discovered. The odds of maintaining operational security across 30 miles of Japanese-held jungle, across 3 days of movement, with guerrilla contacts in multiple villages and aerial reconnaissance flights overhead, the odds approached 0. But it worked. Every piece worked. Filipino guerrillas in villages along the route put chickens in cages so they wouldn't squawk. They tied up dogs. They kept children indoors. When Japanese patrols approached, runners sprinted ahead to warn the Americans, who melted into the jungle until the danger passed. At one point, a column of Japanese trucks rolled past within 50 yards of where Rangers lay hidden in a drainage ditch. The drivers never looked their direction. Captain Juan Pajota's guerrilla force joined them, 200 men who would serve as guides and, critically, as the blocking force at the Cabu River bridge. These men knew the terrain intimately. They knew which paths flooded during rain, which rice paddies had solid ground beneath the water, which barrios had collaborators. Without them, the mission would have been impossible. By the morning of January 29th, the force was in position 5 miles north of the camp. The Alamo Scouts reported the intelligence that would determine the day's operation: approximately 300 Japanese guards in the camp, 1,000 troops across the Cabu River, approximately 5,000 in Cabanatuan City. The prison held 512 men, give or take. The numbers kept changing as men died. Lieutenant Colonel Mucci gathered his officers. "We attack at 1945 hours," he said. 15 minutes before full dark. We'll have just enough light to see what we're doing. He looked at each man. "Remember, all of the prisoners go. No one is left behind. I don't care if you have to carry 2 men on your back. We don't leave a single one." Captain Robert Prince, who had designed the tactical plan, reviewed it one final time. The Rangers would approach across 800 yards of open ground, cleared by the Japanese specifically to prevent escape attempts. They would assault 2 gates simultaneously. Bazooka teams would target any vehicles or armor. Machine gun teams would suppress the guard towers. Rifle squads would clear the barracks and round up prisoners. The Alamo Scouts would secure the front gate and create a corridor for evacuation. Filipino guerrillas would defend the Cabu River bridge and provide carabao carts for prisoners too weak to walk. It was a plan that required perfect timing, perfect execution, and perfect luck. The kind of plan that gets people killed when any variable fails. That afternoon they crawled into position. For 3 hours they lay in the grass under the sun, then in the cooling dusk, waiting for darkness. Prince remembered the mosquitoes most vividly. Swarms of them. You couldn't swat them. Any movement might give away position. So you let them bite, let them drink, and focused on the work ahead. Inside the camp, the prisoners had no idea rescue was coming. Most were in their barracks, conserving energy. Some attended a prayer service. A few played cards with worn decks that had been shared among hundreds of men over 3 years. They expected to die in this place. Some welcomed it. January 30, 1945, 7:45 p.m., 8:15 p.m. The raid. When the P-61 Black Widow roared over the camp at 7:45 p.m., every Japanese guard stopped what they were doing and watched the sky. The pilot, whose name was lost to history, performed a show, barrel rolls, steep climbs, engine backfires that sounded like explosions. For 90 seconds, every enemy eye was pointed upward. The Rangers moved. Prince's assault force rushed the main gate. Murphy's support element hit the rear entrance. The distance they covered, 800 yards of open ground, should have taken 3 minutes at a combat crawl. They did it in 90 seconds, propelled by adrenaline and the knowledge that every second mattered. At exactly 7:45 p.m., Lieutenant John Murphy's bazooka teams opened fire on the guard towers. The first rounds detonated with white phosphorus flowers, turning wooden structures into instant infernos. Machine guns raked the guard barracks. In the first 15 seconds of the attack, every Japanese position of advantage was neutralized. A Ranger shot the main gate lock off with a .45 pistol, 3 rounds, 3 failures, 4th round success. The gate swung open. Inside, chaos. Prisoners hearing gunfire thought the Japanese were executing them. Some ran. Some hid under barracks. Some too weak to move simply waited for death. The Rangers had to shout, had to physically grab men and pull them toward the gates. "We're Americans. We're here to get you out." Private First Class Richard Beck, now weighing 83 pounds, was in his barracks when the shooting started. He remembered thinking very clearly that this was it. The Japanese were going to kill everyone. He crawled under his bunk, not to hide, but because there was nowhere else to go. When a Ranger burst through the door yelling, "Come on, we're getting you out," Beck thought he was hallucinating. Malaria caused hallucinations. Starvation caused hallucinations. This had to be one of those. The Ranger grabbed him by the arm, the physical contact, the American accent, the urgency, and Beck understood. This was real. They had come. He tried to stand. His legs buckled. The Ranger caught him, lifted him in a fireman's carry, and ran for the gate. All across the compound, this scene repeated 512 times. Rangers carrying prisoners who weighed less than 80 pounds. Some Rangers carried 2 men. Medic Jimmy Fisher moved through the barracks, calling for the wounded, triaging on the fly. Who could walk? Who needed carrying? Who was too injured to move quickly? No one was too injured. Mucci's order was absolute. Everyone goes. Outside, Japanese forces attempted counterattacks. Troops from across the river tried to reinforce. They ran straight into Captain Pajota's guerrillas, who had set up a devastating ambush at the Cabu River bridge. The battle there was brief and brutal. Pajota's men held the line for the crucial 30 minutes, fighting with a fury born from 3 years of occupation, 3 years of watching their country brutalized. When the Rangers withdrew with the prisoners, not a single Japanese soldier had crossed that bridge. At 8:15 p.m., exactly 30 minutes after the first shot, the last prisoner was out of the compound. The raid had succeeded, but the mission was only half complete. Now came the 30-mile journey back to American lines, carrying 512 men who could barely walk. January 30-31, 1945. The withdrawal. The Carabao carts were waiting at the rendezvous point. 26 wooden carts pulled by water buffalo, arranged by Filipino guerrillas who had spent days gathering them from local farms. Each cart could hold 6 to 8 men if they packed tight. The prisoners climbed aboard, some with assistance, some literally lifted by Rangers, whose own muscles screamed from 3 days of combat operations. But 26 carts wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. As the column moved through the first village, Filipino civilians emerged with more carts. And in the next village, more. And the next. Women who had hidden rice from Japanese requisitions brought out food for the prisoners. Children ran alongside the column, faces bright with joy at seeing Americans free. Old men wept openly. By the time the column reached American lines on the morning of January 31st, 106 Carabao carts were in the procession. An entire population had risen to support the rescue. Private First Class John Richardson, the medic who had survived the Death March, rode in one of the carts. He remembered seeing an American flag draped over a bush at the side of the road as they crossed into friendly territory. "I don't think I realized I was fully freed until that moment," he said later. "I saw that flag and I looked around and I don't think there was a dry eye." The price: 2 Rangers killed, 20 guerrillas wounded, an estimated 523 Japanese soldiers killed, though the exact number was never determined. All 512 prisoners rescued, every single one. Here is where the story becomes almost unbearably complex, where the neat moral categories of war dissolve into something more troubling and profound. In 1944, the same year these men were starving at Cabanatuan, German and Italian prisoners of war held in camps across the United States were receiving medical care that exceeded what many American civilians could access. The numbers are stark, documented, impossible to dismiss. The death rate for German POWs in U.S. Custody in 1944 was 1.5 per 1,000 per year. For comparison, the death rate among American civilians of similar age and gender was approximately 2 per 1,000. German prisoners, many arriving wounded or malnourished, received better medical care in American captivity than they would have in Germany. The U.S. military operated over 150 hospitals and hospital wards attached to POW camps. German prisoners received penicillin, the miracle antibiotic that was in short supply even for American troops. They received complex surgeries, specialized diets, physical therapy. The Geneva Convention required that POWs receive the same medical care as the holding power's troops. The American military exceeded that requirement. German doctors working in these camps documented the conditions in letters and post-war testimonies. They described facilities that were better equipped than many hospitals in wartime Germany. They described guards who treated them with professional courtesy. They described meals with more calories than German soldiers were receiving on the front lines. At the same time, American prisoners in Japanese camps were dying at rates of 30-50 per day. They were being worked to death in slave labor projects. They were being executed for sport. They were eating grass and worms and considering it a meal. The Japanese military death rate for POWs in their custody was approximately 27%. More than 1 in 4 prisoners died. In some camps, the rate approached 50%. This is not a story with a simple moral. This is not a tale of good versus evil, where the lines are clean and the lessons are obvious. This is a story about the same war, fought by the same generation, producing radically different outcomes depending entirely on which side of the wire you stood. The men rescued from Cabanatuan came home to a country that had treated its enemies with dignity and medical excellence, while those same men were being starved and brutalized. Some found it incomprehensible. Some found it infuriating. Some found it the single greatest evidence they had ever witnessed of what separated their civilization from the one that had imprisoned them. Private First Class Richard Beck, who weighed 83 pounds at liberation, needed 3 years to recover from tuberculosis and malnutrition. He spent that time in American hospitals alongside German POWs who were also recovering from various ailments. He never spoke about whether he resented their presence, whether he wondered why they received care while he had been left to die in a bamboo barracks half a world away. But in his later years, when he spoke to school groups about his experiences, he always made one point very clearly. The Japanese didn't treat us according to the Geneva Convention, but we treated them according to ours. That's the difference. That's what we were fighting for, the right to be different than them. February 2nd, 1945. The world learns. News of the rescue was released to the public on February 2nd, 1945. The newspapers called it the Great Raid. Photographs showed skeletal men in tattered uniforms smiling from carabao carts. The American public, reading these stories over breakfast, began to understand what their soldiers had endured in Japanese captivity. The raid itself became legendary in military circles, a textbook example of special operations executed under impossible conditions. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci and Captain Robert Prince received Distinguished Service Crosses. The Alamo Scouts received Presidential Unit citations. Every Ranger received at least a Bronze Star, but the medals were beside the point. The point was 512 men who got to go home. The point was 512 families who received telegrams that began with, "We are pleased to inform you," instead of, "We regret to inform you." The point was children who grew up with fathers, wives who grew old with husbands, communities that welcomed back neighbors they thought they'd lost forever. Colonel James Duckworth, who broke one arm at the start of the war and broke his other arm falling during the raid, lived to age 95. He spent 50 years giving talks about the rescue, always beginning with the same words. "I owe my life to men I never met, who risked everything to save strangers." How do you repay a debt like that? You can't, of course. That's the nature of such debts. You carry them. You honor them by living well, by remembering, by telling the story until it becomes part of the national memory. The 6th Ranger Battalion was deactivated after the war, its members scattered to civilian life. Many never spoke about the raid except when asked directly. Combat veterans understand that the moments you're most proud of are often the ones most difficult to discuss because they required you to become someone you would never choose to be in peacetime, to do things that haunt you even as you know they were necessary. But on January 30th, for 30 minutes in the darkening Philippine dusk, they were exactly who they needed to be. Angels of death for some, angels of deliverance for others. The thin line between extinction and rescue. Here is the question the rescue raises, the one that successive generations have wrestled with. Could the United States have done more? Could we have rescued more prisoners, liberated more camps, saved more lives? The answer is yes and no, and it's complicated. The Japanese had scattered POWs across their empire, in camps on Java, Sumatra, Borneo, Formosa, Manchuria, the Japanese home islands. Many of these camps were discovered only after the war ended. Some were liberated by advancing forces. Some were not liberated until after the atomic bombs forced Japanese surrender in August 1945. After Cabanatuan, the American military launched several more rescue operations. On February 3rd, they liberated Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila, freeing over 3,700 civilian internees. On February 4th, they freed Bilibid prison. On February 23rd, in one of the war's most daring operations, paratroopers and Filipino guerrillas rescued over 2,000 civilians and POWs from Los Baños prison camp, 70 miles behind Japanese lines. But thousands more died in camps that were never reached in time. Thousands died on hell ships. Thousands died in the final months of the war as Japan, facing defeat, simply stopped feeding prisoners. The men rescued from Cabanatuan were in many ways the lucky ones. They were in the right place at the right time, close enough to American lines for a rescue to be feasible, few enough in number to be evacuated. The randomness of their salvation haunted many of them for the rest of their lives. "Why me?" John Richardson asked in an interview 50 years later. "Why did I survive when so many others didn't? I don't have an answer. I'll never have an answer. I just try to live in a way that honors the ones who didn't make it. That, perhaps, is all any survivor can do." Live. Remember, tell the story. Make the debt mean something by refusing to let it be forgotten. As of 2025, the last survivors of the Cabanatuan rescue are gone. the Rangers who conducted the raid, the Alamo Scouts who scouted the route, the Filipino guerrillas who guided and fought and provided the Carabao carts, all have passed into history. What remains are the stories, the photographs, the meticulously documented after-action reports, the memorials at the prison camp site in the Philippines where Philippine and American flags fly side by side, the memory of what 121 Rangers and 200 guerrillas accomplished in 30 minutes on a January evening in 1945, the memory, too, of what the United States did for its enemies during that same war, the medical care, the Geneva Convention compliance, the determination to remain civilized even in the midst of total war, and the memory of what was done to American prisoners, the systematic brutality that killed 27% of them, that forced the ones who survived to become something other than human, just to endure. These memories exist in tension with each other. They resist easy synthesis. They complicate our understanding of the war, of ourselves, of what it means to maintain moral standards when the enemy has abandoned all such pretense. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the lesson isn't simple. Perhaps the story of Cabanatuan is meant to be complicated, difficult, unresolved, a mirror that shows us both our capacity for extraordinary courage and our vulnerability to extraordinary cruelty, often separated by nothing more than an accident of birth, a randomness of circumstance, a uniform's color. The men who were rescued that night in January 1945 understood this better than anyone. They had experienced the worst of human nature, and then, in a single evening, witnessed some of the best. They spent the rest of their lives trying to reconcile those two extremes, trying to explain to people who had never known such degradation or such deliverance what it meant to have your faith in humanity destroyed and restored within the span of a single decade. Most couldn't explain it. The words didn't exist. So they told the simple version. The Rangers came. They got us out. We went home. But the full story, the real story, is the space between those sentences, the 3 years of waiting, the death toll, the arbitrary cruelty, the stubborn, impossible hope that someone, somewhere, was coming, the 30-mile dash through enemy territory by men who had never met the prisoners but risked everything to save them anyway. That story, in all its complicated glory, belongs to the ages now. We inherit it. We carry it forward. We remember. And perhaps, if we're honest with ourselves, we wonder, would we have the courage to cross those 30 miles? Would we have the strength to survive those 3 years? Would we maintain our principles when the enemy abandoned theirs? The men of Cabanatuan answered those questions with their lives. Their answer echoes across 8 decades, a testament to the best and worst of what human beings are capable of and the razor-thin line that separates the two.